The majority of large multinational firms come from the so-called West, meaning mostly North America and Europe. But most growth and profit is not in the West for global companies anymore. In recent years, think tanks like McKinsey have introduced sound bites like the Asian century and the future is Asian. With a combination of efficient production and customers hungry for global brands, Asian markets rescued entire sectors such as automotive, high-end fashion retail, electronics, and even renewable energy equipment. Multinational companies and ambitious executives follow opportunity and life quality. They are usually aware of the need for intercultural awareness and skills when they relocate from East to West, but increasingly, Western expats move from one Asian country to another, and that creates an entirely different dynamic. I am Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership consultant based in China for over 20 years and currently splitting my time between Asia and Europe. What we call the Asian century was preceded by the rise of the so-called Asian tiger economies, including South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan in the 1990s. But since the beginning of the new millennium, China's rapid rise as a center of manufacturing, logistics, and technological development set the tone for the Asian century. Of course, big stories like this never really end. Conscious efforts by Asian economies to both challenge and imitate China's dominance and radical changes brought by the last couple of years are opening new chapters in the epic story of rising Asian economies. Global firms follow markets and profits and bring their managers with them. Around the time when I arrived in China in 2002, most of the multinational managers I started coaching had no significant experience in Asia. Those who did had typically relocated from places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, or Singapore. Their bosses assumed that experience there would smoothly translate into leadership skills in mainland China, which, after all, is just another place with typical Asian values. Managers with no previous Asian experience also received cultural briefings in how Buddhist and Confucian traditions and ancient texts like Sun Tzu's Art of War would help them negotiate contracts, run factories and data centers in China. As it turned out, it wasn't that simple. Today, as China's previously unstoppable economic engine runs slower, openness towards the outside world gives way to political caution. Other Asian economies readily jump in to fill in the resulting gaps in business. While I coach, train, and advise multinational executives who decide whether or not to relocate some of their operations from China, the names of some countries come up more often than others. Events in India promise a replication of China's early success story, complete with a young and eager population and developing infrastructure, but also complemented with the country's good command of English. Southeast Asian nations, like Singapore and Thailand, make targeted efforts to attract the firms and expats who ponder exit strategies out of China. Studies show that since 2020, tens of thousands of expatriates have moved out of China, a significant proportion of them to other Asian economies. Many managers I personally know still belong to Chinese operations on paper, but actually manage their teams remotely from Seoul, Singapore, or Bangkok. Paperwork will follow the facts on the ground, and former China expats will settle into their new locations. Once again, similarly to when they moved into China, the headquarters of global firms will assume that experience in one Asian culture gracefully translates into success elsewhere in the region. But as they relocate from one Asian country to another, many multinational managers will experience similar culture shocks moving east to east as they did relocating from east to west. It is part of human nature to assume that places far from us are similar to each other and places near to us are different. For a typical European, the distance, both geographic and cultural, between China, Japan, and Singapore may seem negligible. The same way someone in Asia may assume that the UK, France, and Greece are part of more or less the same cultural tradition. But when I prepare executives for overseas jobs, both Western and Asian ones, I remind them how risky it is for business people to disregard differences within continents or even within some of the enormous nations in the Asian continent. When managers move or even do regular business between places within Asia, they will discover that their teams, clients, and suppliers in Japan, China, and India, and in different cities within these places, have vastly different approaches to meeting someone for the first time, building trust, negotiating details, keeping promises, and working together in the long run. Let's look at what kind of problems can result from a simplistic approach to East-West leadership, what the most typical mistakes are, and what managers can do to avoid them. The most fundamental problems I see at multinational companies comes from the assumption that technical expertise is concrete and measurable, but cultures are messy and mysterious. As a consequence, many human resource managers choose candidates for faraway expat assignments based on their technical expertise and track record, with no regard to how well or badly their temperament suits the culture of the business unit, city, and country where they relocate. This is a dangerous approach because when you move an experienced manager somewhere far away, the technology, legal and financial environment, and how people work with each other will all be different. Problems will look familiar, but the well-tested solutions will often fail in the new environment. Meanwhile, the person's temperament and work style will remain the same, which is why in expat jobs, a good cultural fit is a better predictor of future success than performance track record in previous jobs. Moreover, cultural differences are not so messy and mystifying as many decision makers think. Widely available, and I must add, inexpensive assessment methodologies make it possible to compare an individual manager's preferred work style with the cultural style of a chosen country, city, employment area, organization, or team. If a professionally qualified manager shows a great fit with the target culture, the company has one more reason to send them there. Many decision makers are reluctant to use these methods because they are afraid to lose candidates who show a poor culture fit with their planned destination. But cultural mismatch simply means that the manager needs additional support in specific skill areas such as negotiation or fast decision making, and the same methods can highlight what those areas are. Culture maps are designed to support, not to reject candidates for expat jobs. Another frequent source of errors is the wide-angle approach to different cultures that I mentioned earlier. Let's imagine that a Western manufacturing firm, like a car company or a pharmaceutical firm, wants to move the Asia headquarters of one business unit from China to India because Chinese labor force is becoming more expensive or because markets are shifting. From a European or North American capital, the culture shock of relocation may not look that dramatic. Both of them are one of those collectivist, conflict-avoiding Asian cultures, right? Actually, no. Ask people from either of these countries, and they will tell you that the differences between typical workplace behaviors in China and India are just as great as between the way people work in Italy and Sweden. Decision makers who are thorough enough to consult a culture map will discover that a nation's location on the map, a geographical map, has little to do with its cultural style. India's mainstream culture is actually closer to that of certain Middle Eastern and Latin American countries than to China. In practice, this means that expat managers must prepare for their east-to-east relocation just as carefully as moving between East and West. And that is something that global firms often neglect. The Italian human resources director of a German automotive firm I interviewed for my upcoming book, Dragon Suit, described his personal experience this way. Managing people in India, my first overseas assignment felt repetitive and stressful. Then I got transferred to China, and its speed, energy, and dynamism swept me off my feet. But it's not only Western managers who need help with cultural adjustment within Asia. When I worked with an Indian manager for the local branch of an Italian industrial firm, he told me this. A few years ago, I worked with a Chinese team, and that's when I understood what they mean when they keep talking about hard work. The culture maps we use at intercultural leadership workshops, coaching, and strategy sessions can translate such differences which often cut across several layers of social interaction, into simple coordinates. Consequently, even people who usually think of assessment and coaching as nonsense, such as managers with an engineering or finance background, begin to see their practical uses. Some applications of the mapping systems compare the mainstream cultures of each society. Others allow multiple comparisons between national cultures, professional areas, the work cultures of teams, departments, and companies, and the behavioral profiles of individual managers. Some maps can even track how the cultures of societies change over time. In our example, the work cultures of China and India differ because the national culture of China shows stronger tendencies of something often called collectivism in cultural studies. In simple words, requiring individuals to fall in line for a shared goal without complaining. People from such cultures easily impress outsiders with their ability to perform in teams, but often make it harder for foreign managers to fit in. For a Westerner, it's much easier to understand the role of an Indian or Filipino boss than a Chinese one. In this respect, for American or European managers, India or certain Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines may feel somewhat more similar to the West than China. In other respects, however, their new Asian locations may be more challenging. The vast majority of expats live and work in half a dozen Chinese cities, including Shanghai, Guangzhou, also known as Canton, Shenzhen, Beijing, and Tianjin, which host so-called special economic zones. These zones were created by the Chinese government especially for hosting foreign investment. Because they have been exposed to the outside world for over a century, these places have their specific cultures. They are much more cosmopolitan than China in general and therefore easier for foreigners for business purposes. When expatriate managers move from one of these Chinese cities to, let's say, Pune, India, or a major city in Vietnam, they must adjust to people being more casual on arriving to meetings on time, work procedures, and quality requirements. To use the language of intercultural consulting, subcultures are just as important as cultures. At leadership workshops and coaching, we use culture maps to account for these differences and turn them into action plans for managers and their teams. It is true that cultures can be changeable and often confusing for people who spent most of their professional lives in the comfort of one culture and its traditions of how to live and work together. But cultures are no more mysterious than the pills or engines or computer codes that international managers have to learn and manage every single day. Today's intercultural leadership tools include the research and experience of several generations of academics, business practitioners, diplomats, and more. When I was a teenager, the Western world was fascinated with the sudden appearance of Japanese, then Korean firms, products, and business partners on the global scene. More recently, it was China, and the Asian century has certainly more surprises in store. Whenever international firms send managers from west to east, east to west, or within the booming Asian continent, some adjustment will be necessary before those expats reach the level of self-confidence and work performance as they did in previous, more familiar locations. That's where I hope that this video, my coaching workshops, keynote speeches and articles can be useful. If you need help to map cultural matches and mismatches for your team, boss or colleagues, check my other videos or the e-learning course whose link is in the description, together with the sources I used today. If you want to go a little bit further and work with me as a coach, consultant or keynote speaker, find me online and drop me a line.